It's so funny that this is just like the introduction. Hilarious. Okay, page 47 here. Introduction to the Intellectual World War. Class Struggle in Theory. Prologue. Prologue. Some books take a decade to write. This one took 3. It even became 3 books in the process. Or actually 4, if one counts the French version I wrote before this trilogy, which the publisher pulled the plug on at the last second for political and economic reasons. It is the result of extensive research and a journey, with many unexpected twists and turns, through the heart of the imperial theory industry. Since it advances a counter-history of contemporary thought that not only challenges established interpretations and hallowed canons, but proposes a historiographical paradigm shift, at least regarding the standard imperial narratives. It is essential that the reader be able to situate it within the material system of knowledge production out of which it emerged. This, after all, is what allowed me to develop my research agenda from subjective self-criticism, which was its starting point, to systemic ideology critique. The autobiographical interlude that follows, the tone of which is markedly different than the rest of the book because it is narrated in the first person, provides an opportunity to dialectically situate the author within the broader material reality that is the project's focal point. This also serves to clarify the motivations behind this work, while detailing its basic orientation, method, and structure. From self-criticism to systemic ideology critique. It's easier to fool someone than convince them that they've been fooled. Attributed to Mark Twain. In the fall of 2001, I was studying philosophy in Paris, France. I had completed a master's degree under the direction of Jacques Derrida, after having worked with Luce Irigaray, and I was involved for my PhD with Alain Badiou. I thought I was on the top of the intellectual world, living my American dream of studying with the leading luminaries of French theory. When the attacks of September 11 happened, I was asked to make sense of the events in a public lecture at one of the institutions where I was teaching. To say I was ill-equipped would be generous. What did I really have to say about what had just happened? Given my training, perhaps I could frame the events, which I scarcely understood at the time, in terms of an irreconcilable difference. Differend? Sorry, I don't know this word. Google help. Help. Differend. Differend. Collins? Oh, it's French. It's just French? Difference. It just means difference. Okay. Good. 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 Right. Given my training, perhaps I could frame the events, which I scarcely understood at the time, in terms of an irreconcilable differend between phrase regimens or confrontation with the big other. Maybe the planet was being deterritorialized under our feet, or we had just entered the desert of the Lacanian real. Sorry, Lacanian real. If all else failed, I could fall back on references to the ever-nebulous difference as the condition of possibility and impossibility of all thought and discourse, thereby making some ponderously abstract metaphysical claims that could not possibly be beholden to reality. As I tried to collect my thoughts and apply them to an actual historical occurrence, I could not help but feel like all of this conceptual gibberish sounded like I was saying we were living in La La Land, an imaginary world of big others, great mystical divides, shifting sands, and personified landscapes. Why not add cellophane flowers and marmalade skies to this surreal conceptual scenery, which made the world seem like an utterly meaningless plaything. I became nauseous thinking about it, and I desperately wanted to go back through the looking glass to retrieve some sense of reality, to have something concrete and meaningful to say. But it was too late, and all I could do with my elite education in the Imperial Corps was cobble together an ill-fated attempt to explain reality through the lens of trend-setting critical theory. Unfortunately, there was at least one important lesson. Sorry, fortunately, there was at least one important lesson. I was forced to see, reflected back at me, an image of what I had become. An utterly meaningless, useless intellectual. Even worse, I had been trained to think of myself in opposite terms, namely, as a participant in the theoretical avant-garde of humanity. The world was upside down. About the Twain quote. Although this is saying it has been widely attributed to Twain, he did not actually write it, according to the Center for Mark Twain Studies, which suggests that W.L. Baldridge penned a statement closer to this formulation. This was one moment of crystallization, which I am intentionally simplifying, in a much more complex trajectory, but it forced me to do something that I was never taught to do. Self-critically reflect on my own theoretical practice. Here I was, after years of vigorous study at premier institutions in Paris, and I was ignorant of imperialism and the geopolitical world in which I was living. I knew so much about things that mattered so incredibly little, and I knew nothing about what counted the most in the world, and was literally an issue of life or death for the majority of humanity in the biosphere. I had passed all of the exams with flying colors and received the highest possible academic distinctions. But what had I really learned? What had I been trained in, most fundamentally, was imperial ignorance. How could I not be shamed, given where I had come from and what I had set out to do? After all, I had grown up on a farm in Kansas, working construction. What had first attracted me to the life of the mind was that I cherished the respite from the grueling manual labor. My earliest intellectual ambitions were to try to understand why life was marred by such drudgery and figure out how it could be ended. What I had learned instead was that, in the words of my legendary maître, Derrida, it is impossible to formulate meaningful sentences with the term social class. Apparently, if you are a renowned intellectual, you can simply will into non-existence through supercilious proclamation the most fundamental structural aspect of life in class society. This, I later realized, is a flagrant performative contradiction. Derrida was signaling his class standing in the very act of making such a statement. It was a shibboleth, in the precise sense of the term. See Jack Derrida, Negotiations, Interventions and Interviews. When I went to college in Iowa in the early 1990s, I sought out the most radical forms of theory available, because I wanted the tools necessary to understand and change a world characterized by exploitation and oppression. What was on offer was French theory, Frankfurt School critical theory, as well as more recent trends in the Anglophone world inspired by these traditions. I therefore dedicated myself to learning all the languages and histories necessary to understand them. Having found French theory, and in particular the work of Derrida, the most challenging, and at least in my young mind, the most radical, I decided that I wanted to try and study under him in Paris. I was able to obtain a scholarship from Rotary International, and I moved there in 1996. My interests in radical theory were thereby canalized through institutional mechanisms in a very specific direction. When I arrived in Paris, I eagerly frequented all of the lectures and seminars by the thinkers who were the most renowned in the United States, as well as those who had a potential to become so, including, in addition to those who I was studying, Etienne Balibar, Hélène Cixous, Julia Kristeva, Francois Laruelle, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jean-Luc Marion, Jacques Rancière, and Paul Ricoeur. I also shunned those doing work that sounded old school or unsophisticated. As a sedulous student, intimidated by being outclassed by my peers, I not only read the writings of these major theorists, but I also carefully studied the texts that they interpreted. I was surprised to discover so many discrepancies between the two. As I would later write in my first book, Derrida was so preoccupied, a la Martin Heidegger, with finding the specter of Western metaphysics haunting canonical texts that he discovered it wherever he wanted, independently of the empirical reality of the texts themselves, not to mention their material context, which he systematically ignored. Although he presented himself as a serious student of history, unlike Derrida, Michel Foucault's work ended up revealing a strikingly similar pattern. For instance, he haughtily proclaimed that there was a crucial distinction between Herkunft and Ursprung, both translate as origin, in Friedrich Nietzsche's writings, but he referenced innumerable texts where these words either did not appear at all or were employed in ways that directly contradicted his interpretation. If their writings did not hold up to a minimum of scholarly scrutiny, how could this book be celebrated as some of the most important work in the world? I thought the same when I read Foucault, frankly. That was my first impression, was like, this is kind of shit. It's kind of shit. I don't understand why everyone talks about this so much. I didn't like it. My reaction to these disappointments was to seek out more radical discourses that were directly engaged in elucidating the concrete, material world. I read broadly in Frankfurt School critical theory and Western Marxism. I also enrolled for a master's degree in the historical social sciences, writing a thesis under the guidance of Borgesian sociologists, and I later completed a postdoctoral degree in political theory. In a similar vein, I began a working group and pooled resources to organize an international lecture series and interviews with cutting-edge critical theorists like Salah Ben Habib, Judith Butler, Nancy Fraser, Chantal Mouffe, Emmanuel Wallerstein, and Cornel West. Here, I thought, were truly political thinkers engaged in understanding the real world and struggling to change it. Increasingly attracted to radical discourses, I dedicated myself to studying the most revolutionary theory I could find, which included the writings of Badiou and Rancière, as well as those of Giorgio Agamben, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, Slavoj Žižek, and many others. Uh-oh, not Žižek. I continued to have doubts and self-doubts, however. For all of these theorists' radical phraseology, the principal takeaway was usually less satisfying. Some, for instance, flatly proclaimed that Gilles Deleuze's addled statements on control societies could better elucidate the world than the scientific approach of dialectical and historical materialism. But they could never clearly explain why or how. Others seemed to be formulating Marxist critiques, but they would frequently be interpreted in the need for to proliferate pseudo-intellectual references or engage, à la Žižek, in navel-gazing reflections about their jouissance and what they saw online that day. They all agreed, including those in the Frankfurt School, that Marxism could only be of value if it was spruced up with the requisite dose of bourgeois culture. This ran the gamut from raucous Lacanian sex jokes on the ultra-left to pedantic Habermasian palaver further to the right, but the consensus was clear. They were all doing something innovative and much more sophisticated than what the old school Marxists had done. It took more than a decade of studying and teaching in Paris, as well as nearly 2 decades of activism and doing my own research on the history of anti-imperialist Marxism and the global socialist movement, to finally start to see the system of knowledge production for what it was. Initially, I had only grasped it from the point of view of a rat in the maze, and I began by mapping out the parts of it that I knew well. Little by little, however, the map started to cohere into a systematic outline, and everything began to fall into place. It was this shift that was the most fundamental. When I was asked to give that ill-fated lecture on September 11, 2001, it led to an intensification of my subjective ideology critique, which consisted in an extremely painful but also absolutely necessary process of calling into question my own indoctrination, which I had misinterpreted as education. However, once I was able, over the course of decades, to build up a materialist analysis of the system of knowledge production, circulation, and consumption within which I had been trained, I could map out the entire maze. It is this that allowed me to begin the deeper and much more important task of systemic ideological criticism. This consists in diagnosing and seeking to dismantle the system that forges individuals and composes them as ideological subjects. If you demonstrate to someone that they've been ideologically inculcated, they may be able to overcome it. If you teach them how the system works that brainwashed them, they are given the tools necessary to liberate themselves and others, because objective ideological criticism of this sort brings into relief the system that produces and will continue to produce and reproduce ideological subjects. This is one of the ultimate objectives of this book, as well as the rest of the trilogy. Namely, to provide an objective ideological critique of the material system of ideas that produced an ideological subject like me, and much importantly, legions of others indoctrinated into the same brand of imperial ignorance. I was, after all, far from being the only one living in a conceptual la-la land, where metaphorical thinking and superstitious free association are considered sophisticated ersatz for rigorous, empirically grounded argumentation, as anyone who has been to a theory conference is, or should be, well aware. And I was certainly not unique in mistakenly assuming that Western or cultural Marxism was the most advanced form of Marxism. The bourgeois knowledge regime is not only epistemological, however, it is a system of power and control. It is one thing to recognize how it works and study it systematically. It is something else entirely to be able to publish one's own findings and have them be taken seriously. Attempting to do so sets one on a collision course with those who own the means of communication and their managers. I would be remiss then not to mention that this entire research project has been extremely difficult to bring into the world. Many platforms have refused to publish its findings, and an equal number have taken potshots at it, usually with no engagement with the evidence. In the most extreme case, I was given a crash course in the real material operations of the imperial theory industry and the awesome power of its gatekeepers by Editions La Fabrique in Paris. As briefly mentioned, this trilogy began years ago as a book I finished for this publishing house, which is After a long process of constant interventions by editors who admitted that they knew little or nothing about the material, but nonetheless insisted that I make changes, they pulled the plug on the entire project right before it was set to go to press. They claimed, in short, that I should have praised instead or critiqued certain golden calves of the imperial theory industry. But the real reason for sinking the project was that it called into question La Fabrique's market niche. I was too naive to understand this at the time, and I thought that self-declared radical publishers would support well-researched scholarship that was pushing the envelope, even if it was critical of some of their established values. La Fabrique provided me with a practical understanding of how the gatekeepers of the imperial theory industry will exclude any in-depth critique of their profit model. Fortunately, though, fortunately, although I lost years of research time, this experience sharpened my analysis by offering an invaluable lesson in the political economy of knowledge production and the power dynamics of publishing. Motive. The truth is warlike. It does not only fight against untruthfulness, but also against certain people who spread untruth. Bertolt Brecht. Why put so much time and energy into engaging in a systemic ideology critique of the Western left intelligentsia? The purpose of this critique is fourfold. First of all, it seeks to elucidate the fundamental driving forces behind ideological production and dissemination, while also detailing the precise mechanisms by which the entire system operates. It thereby provides people with an understanding of the social totality that situates ideas within the broader framework of material reality and class struggle. This aspect of ideology critique cultivates a scientific understanding of how the world of ideas operates, shedding light on the ways in which the dominant ideology is produced and perpetuated, whose interests it serves, whom it targets, and how exactly it functions in specific situations. Ideological criticism of the left intelligentsia in the imperial core contributes, in this way, to a more scientific account of the production, circulation, and consumption of ideas. The literal marketplace of ideas. This is what this book is about. The literal marketplace of ideas. The second purpose is to provide a more scientifically rigorous analysis of reality in general, above and beyond ideology. Science should not be understood in reductively positivist terms as the perfect apprehension of objective reality, but rather as a collective process of establishing the most coherent framework of explanation, testing it in practical reality, and continuing to perfect it based on new information. Science is thus a fallibilistic process of developing knowledge via the dialectical relationship between human beings and the larger material world. Engaging in systemic ideological criticism thereby not only allows us to properly diagnose and fully understand the disease of ideology, but it also helps to cultivate the cure by apprehending material reality in the most rigorous manner possible. The intellectual world war, that is the focal point of the study, is not only an ideological battle. It is a fight over the very nature of reality, as well as who has the right and the power to define it. The third reason to undertake a systemic ideology critique is to provide the most coherent framework for practical action, since the point is not only to understand reality, but to change it. One of the goals of this project is to rejuvenate class struggle in theory, as a contribution to an overall revitalization of class struggle. Much of what passes for intellectual debate in the imperial core takes place within the same fundamental ideological framework. and it is relatively rare to have this called into question. Anti-communism, for instance, remains largely hegemonic, even among those who are self-declared Marxists or even communists. One of the most pernicious effects of the dominant ideology has been a discrediting and perversion of dialectical and historical materialism, DHM, based on widespread misrepresentations and propagandistic versions of history. Given the proven ability of dialectical and historical materialism to serve as a practical guide to action with a proven record of success, one of the most pressing tasks of the class struggle in theory is to shore up and further develop this tradition. He's really formal with the way he talks. I mean, he is an academic, right? But he's basically saying here that if you're going to study theory, then you have to study all the theory, and they don't teach you about communism. They teach you about anti-communism. A lot of anti-communism is baked into the curriculum, but you're not actually engaging with the economic theory of socialism. You're not engaging with the reality, right? So if you want to be a serious academic, if you really want to study this, then how can you study it if you aren't including everyone in the conversation? Like, if the debate is just between all these white French, primarily French, theory guys, then what are we doing? Last but certainly not least, this critique of the Western left intelligentsia is part of a broader critical reflection on the history of the left of the imperial core and the need for a fundamental reorientation. Theory, Marx incisively explained, takes on real power in the world when it comes to grip the masses. The anti-communist, capitalist, accommodationist theory in the Western left intelligentsia has seized the masses to the point of becoming hegemonic within the broader left. This is due in large part to the material position of the working class of the imperial core, which is situated as a labor aristocracy at the apex of the global division of labor. But it is also the result of the ideological power wielded by the imperial intelligentsia. In attacking the latter, the ultimate goal is to reorient the left in general, above and beyond the intelligentsia, towards an anti-imperialist politics that embraces, rather than rejects, projects of socialist sovereignty. Why, though, be so critical of the Western left and its leading intellectuals? The short answer is because they have abandoned, sidelined, or modified beyond recognition the primary weapon of class struggle for the working and oppressed peoples of the world. This is partially a result of the global class standing of the Western left intelligentsia, or what would better be described as the intellectual labor aristocracy. As members of the imperial professional managerial class stratum, these intellectuals are perched comfortably atop a global system of intellectual production. They do not have any material incentive to change the system, since it supports and even promotes them. And they have, therefore, tended to accommodate capitalism and even imperialism by maintaining that there is no real-world alternative. The Western left intelligentsia's general abandonment of revolutionary politics comes into sharp relief in a historical conjuncture where the stakes of an international class struggle could not be higher. We have definitively entered an age of exterminism, according to Georges Gastaut, when it is a code red for humanity and the entire planet. Capitalist social murder is systemically destroying life, as Ali Qadri has powerfully argued, and global socioeconomic inequality has never been more extreme. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% of humanity in 2017 controlled more than half of the world's wealth. The top 30% of the population controlled more than 95% of the global wealth, while the remaining 70% of the population had to make do with less than 5% of the world's resources. William I. Robinson, Who Rules the World? To put this into perspective, this means that 80% of the world's people live on less than $10 per day. The poorest half of the global population lives on less than $2.50 a day, and more than 1.3 billion live only on 1.25 a day, $1.25. The doomsday clock that measures the risks of nuclear annihilation is closer to midnight than at any point in history. The destruction of the biosphere, already well underway, is advancing at the most alarming rate ever known. Class struggle today is not only a question of life and death for certain individuals or even large groups, it is for the entire species and the planet. Given these material circumstances, more trenchant forms of criticism are clearly necessary to shake people out of the dominant ideology of anti-communism before it is too late. Ideas do not change reality in and of themselves, unless they become a material force through coordinated mass action. This investigation is rather specialized because it drills down into the material history of the fetishized commodities of the imperial theory industry. Its target audience is the intelligentsia, in the broadest sense of the term. However, its fundamental message that socialism is the solution does not at all require specialized knowledge. This work thereby seeks to contribute to the all-important work of reorienting the left before it is too late. Method. Dialectics as living, many-sided knowledge, with the number of sides eternally increasing, with an infinite number of shades of every approach and approximation to reality, with a philosophical system growing into a whole out of each shade. Vladimir Lenin. I know that guy. One of the predominant accounts of at least some of the theoretical traditions examined in this trilogy, including by self-declared Marxists of the Western persuasion, consists in framing them in terms of a relationship between so-called postmodernism, an extremely loose conceptual category with questionable value, and neoliberalism. Since they both emerged at about the same time, and the latter refers to the economic base and the former to the ideological superstructure, it is assumed that there must be some kind of connection between the two. Both categories are often reified in very abstract terms, and the accounts of their inner relationship generally tend to slip, a la Frederick Jameson, into idealist forms of historiography by relying on vague appeals to the zeitgeist or spirit of the times. Furthermore, class struggle often disappears into thin air, and there is little to no account of imperialism and the anti-colonial struggle for socialism. Instead, we are simply told that there is a new era of capitalism that ushered in a novel way of thinking and producing culture. In these accounts, there is rarely, if ever, a materialist analysis of the political economy of knowledge and culture, the institutional matrices of the superstructure, geopolitical class struggle, psychological warfare operations, concrete theoretical and cultural practices, and all of the linkages between between specific cultural networks and the material forces driving and shaping them. In other words, what tends to be lacking is detailed materialist analysis and dialectics in the precise sense defined by Lenin in the epigraph. Dialectics, in addition to recognizing reality as composed of interrelational processes rather than reified entities, is a form of living knowledge that is multifaceted and fine-grained insofar as it seeks to grasp the intricacies of material reality in an ongoing process of conceptual elucidation that strives to delineate the overall system of relations. One of the methodological objectives of this book and its companion volumes is to demonstrate the explanatory superiority of a dialectical and historical materialist approach to knowledge, and by extension, culture. Far from postulating reified binary abstractions and arbitrarily linking them via idealist historiography that includes class struggle, it delves into the minute details of the concrete points of connection between the economic forces driving society and the specific ways in which they shape the production, circulation, and consumption of knowledge. It also situates class struggle at the center of its analysis and elucidates how the radical theory industry in the imperial core is related to a broad series of psychological warfare operations aimed at shoring up, at a minimum, anti-communism and capitalist accommodation. Furthermore, it simultaneously demonstrates how these operations have failed to contain the many-headed hydra that they are trying to defeat, precisely due to ongoing class struggle in both theory and practice. Unlike the zeitgeist historiography of reified epochs, characteristic of many Western Marxist accounts, the study advances on the basis of a dialectical historiography that is always attentive to three heuristically distinct dimensions of history: time, space, and class stratification. Historical reality does not march along undialectically as a unified entity with absolute distinct stages. It is a highly differentiated reality based on the geographical location under discussion, as well as the specific class stratum, both of which are essential dimensions for bringing into relief the realities of class struggle, which has often taken the form of the struggle between nations. Moreover, change is always invariably distributed across these three dimensions, meaning that there are no simple and clean breaks when a new era magically appears, such as that of neoliberalism or postmodernism. This book, as well as the others of this trilogy, provides a fine-grained analysis of the dialectical relationship between the general system of knowledge and the individual subjects of knowledge production. Marxism has often been denigrated for purportedly privileging the system over and against the subject. So much so that Western Marxists have regularly claimed that it was necessary to supplement their analyses with subjectively oriented discourses like phenomenology, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. Do not do abstraction, yes. In general, the subjectivism and idealism that plagues these approaches have not, however, enhanced Marxism, but have rather served to dilute it with liberal ideology. Rigorous DHM analysis always accounts for the subject as well as the system, individuals along with collectivities, agency, as well as forms of determination. However, it does not reify those as distinct and opposed poles, but rather understands them as intertwined processes whose complexity far surpasses our simplistic concepts. Discussing an earlier phase of capitalism, Lenin similarly rejected epochal thinking. Epic. Epochal. Needless to say, all the boundaries in nature and in society are conditional and changeable, and consequently, it would be absurd to discuss the exact year or the decade in which imperialism definitely became established. Vladimir Lenin. Essential Works of Lenin, What is to be Done, and Other Writings. This investigation does not only include a materialist elucidation of the political economy of knowledge, the intellectual sector of the superstructure, and the imperial theory industry. It also goes to great lengths to analyze in detail the lives and works of the subjects in question, including many of the major figures of the Frankfurt School, French theory, and contemporary critical theory more generally. Instead of relying on an opposition between internal analysis, the preferred method of bourgeois humanities, and external analysis, the dominant approach in the bourgeois social sciences. The study proposes a dialectical elucidation of the theoretical practices of subjects working within specific systems of knowledge. It thereby brings into relief how both of these reference points are actually processes that are so enmeshed in one another that separating them out through conceptual abstraction distorts their material reality. In other words, it makes little sense to act as if there were phenomena like Adorno's philosophy or Derrida's thought independently of the systems of knowledge, as well as the forces driving them, that gave birth to thinkers like these and played a major role in producing and disseminating their work. The same is true of these systems themselves, which could not function without the subjects operative within them, and that would not operate in the precise manner that they have without the specific contributions that particular subjects have made. Much of what passes for ideology critique within the Western Marxist tradition amounts to a critical analysis of the ideology uh, operative within a particular subject or a specific object within, a specific object such as a cultural product. Although this book, like its sister tomes, engages with this type of work, it is also dedicated to developing a level of ideology critique that focuses on the objective systems that produce particular ideologies. Confusion. This part is a little dry. This is literally just the methods of the book. And he's saying like why he's doing this. It started as a self-crit, and he decided it was a larger indictment of all of Western Marxism. This is one of the reasons for examining such a broad swath of intellectual production across traditions that are often considered to be distinct or even openly opposed to one another, as German critical theory and French theory are often presented. It is precisely in order to demonstrate that there are objective socioeconomic forces undergirding these theoretical trends and contributing to their ideological alignment on the most fundamental issues. From a dialectical and historical materialist perspective, it makes perfect sense that there would be so much ideological and so much ideological consistency. The subjects of knowledge production under scrutiny are all part of the same class formation and have been ideologically composed in a similar manner. They have been trained in elite educational institutions in the imperial core to participate in the basic forms of exchange value driven theory. They have been trained in elite educational institutions in the imperial core to participate in the same basic forms of exchange value driven theoretical practice. They have also generally operated within nearly identical internal national networks and participated in similar activities. In many cases, particularly within the later traditions of French theory and US driven radical theory, they have generally spent their entire lives reading and responding to one another. Most important, they have been working within a material system of knowledge production owned and controlled, directly or indirectly, by the same class that sets the ultimate rules of the game. One thing they all share is that they have succeeded, albeit in different ways, in playing that game. There is thus a coherent relationship between their subjective ideologies and the objective systems that have produced them, which fosters a remarkable amount of ideological uniformity. In an effort to give the best possible form to this dialectical approach to history and hermeneutics, um, The study mobilizes a constellational methodology. Rather than a linear narrative, a big picture overview, or snapshots of purported time periods or individual thinkers, it seeks to discursively perform what Lenin called many-sided knowledge. Every subsection of each chapter provides a detailed analysis of one facet of the overall reality under examination. This allows us to descend to a level of microscopic scrutiny that brings out all of the various details that, in a broader overview, would need to be jettisoned. At the same time, each of these micro studies fits into a coherent system that takes the shape of a constellation in which every subsection is a nodal point. This brings into view a telescopic apprehension of the totality of the system of knowledge under analysis. This constellational method thereby fosters a clear understanding of the total system, with all of its complexities and different dimensions, via a nuanced account of specific nodal points within it. Finally, it bears recalling that dialectics is, as Lenin emphasized, a living knowledge, meaning that it is constantly expanding and refining itself into relationship to a reality whose complexity far surpasses our simple conceptual tools. There is, in this regard, much more work to be done, and these books do not presume to be exhaustive or definitive. They seek, instead, to make a contribution to a living knowledge in the material sense, meaning a knowledge of our lives that can serve as a vital force for practically reconfiguring them. The fundamental point, then, of the diagnosis that follows is not simply for us to increase our knowledge, it is for us to learn from the past and present so that we can transform our lived reality in the future. This guy's sounding pretty freaking Marxist-Leninist to me. I don't know about you. The road ahead. This book opens with 3 chapters that serve as a discourse on Marxist method for the project as a whole. The first elucidates the dialectical and historical materialist approach to ideas, shedding light on the modus operandi of imperial intellectual superstructure in general. The second chapter provides an overview of some of the material networks of the empire of ideas that have been built up by the leading imperialist powers over the last century or so, and which serve as the general backdrop for the intellectual world war. The third turns more specifically to the imperial theory industry as a major force for shoring up and promoting a form of compatible critical theory over and against the revolutionary tradition of DHM. All 3 of these chapters provide the methodological and conceptual framework necessary for understanding and correctly situating all of the more specific analyses that follow. Part 2 of this book focuses on the Frankfurt School, and it drills down into a tradition that has been one of the principal driving forces behind what is called Western or cultural Marxism. It begins with an analysis of the deep-seated and dogmatic anti-communism of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, which was appreciated and supported by powerful segments of the capitalist ruling class and sectors of the bourgeois state, including the CIA. It then examines the work of 7 Frankfurt scholars who were directly employed by the U.S. government in propaganda organizations like the Office of War Information, OWI, and Voice of America, intelligence agencies like the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the State Department. It also examines the complexities of these developments by unpacking the convoluted case of Frankfurt School research associates who were in contact with Soviet intelligence. The final chapter is a deep dive into the life and work of perhaps the most prominent figure in Western Marxism, the man the bourgeois press proclaimed to be the godfather of the New Left, Herbert Marcuse. Many questions have been raised about his work for the U.S. government, and some have accused him of being an agent of imperialism. Now that the archival record has finally come to light, it is possible to situate Marcuse more precisely within the intellectual world war on communism, and his contributions are more far-reaching and problematic than most would likely assume. Saunders's book was published under a different title in the United States, The Cultural Cold War. U.S. edition was almost scrapped because Free Press, which had published many of the authors critically uh, analyzed by Saunders, tried to force her to add a disclaimer reversing the book's fundamental argument. She was asked to write that the CIA was on the side of the angels and that America was a good cause. Wow. When she refused, the Free Press dumped the project and sent her a bill for $15,000. Fortunately, New Press picked up the project and hired a lawyer to obtain the rights and save the book. Wow. The title of this first volume, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, echoes the path-breaking work by Francis Stoner Saunders, Who Paid the Piper, the CIA, and the Cultural War. Engaging in extensive archival research, Saunders demonstrated the role of the foundations of the ruling class and the intelligence services in funding and promoting anti-communist culture and the compatible left. The focus here is more specifically on the intelligentsia and the theory industry, but it shares with Saunders' book the fundamental question of the political economy of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. It is by answering the question of who paid the pipers that we can bring to light the material forces driving the promotion of the dominant ideology. The Frankfurt School has commonly been interpreted, at least within the imperial core, as having contributed to a type of Marxism that is more sophisticated and culturally savvy than those forms of Marxism, many of them Eastern-oriented, that purportedly suffered from economism, reductive determinism, productivism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, teleology, and so forth. This was one of the primary ideological objectives of the powerful forces in the capitalist class and the bourgeois state that supported Western Marxism as a weapon of ideological warfare against the revolutionary Marxism of the anti-imperialists. The position that is widely accepted today as common sense by the imperial intelligentsia, namely that Western Marxism is somehow more advanced, is thus a consequence of a semi-clandestine intellectual world war. This dogma will be called out for what it is, and the real specificity of Western Marxism will come clearly into view. It is an ideological construct aimed at transforming the greatest theoretical weapon of class struggle from below into an ineffectual philosophical position that is accommodationist towards capitalism and even imperialism. German-style critical theory has served as one of the two most important foundational reference points for the imperial theory industry. The other is French theory, and it is this tradition that the forthcoming second volume turns. Whereas the Frankfurt School revised Marxism to such an extent that it became, in many ways, anti-Marxism. French theory has largely been marketed as a more radical form of thinking that surpasses Marxism, or at least remix it in a highly original and idiosyncratic ways. One of its trademarks has been to question totalizing forms of explanation, identity thinking, the resolution of contradictions through dialectics and so forth. What Deleuze referred to as French theory's generalized anti-Hegelianism is but a thin cover for its generalized anti-Marxism, as we will see, in spite of the fact that some French theorists have sought to recuperate Marx as one philosopher among others within the bourgeois canon, thereby using him to bolster their symbolic capital as radicals. In either case, one of the goals of the French theorists has been to bury anti-imperialist Marxism as passé and promote themselves as the vanguard of human thought. The world's leading imperialist power, the United States, not only strongly supported them in this endeavor, but its global networks of knowledge production were largely responsible for making this coterie of anti-Marxist French intellectuals into global superstars. Following the same basic pattern of as the Frankfurt School, the capitalist ruling class was in on the coup, as well as the state, and the CIA identified French theory as a major ally in its intellectual world war on communism. That's your guy? These your guys that the CIA loves? The final volume in this trilogy engages head-on with a question that my previous publications on the Frankfurt School and French theory have often generated. If there has been a confluence of interest between the imperial ruling class and compatible critical theory of the German or French variety, are these patterns visible in the contemporary forms of cutting-edge theory promoted in the imperial core? In particular, many scholars and activists, including self-proclaimed Marxists, have been impressed by a relatively novel brand of radical theory that has been heavily marketed since the turn of the 21st century. Figures like Agamben, Badiou, Balibar, Butler, Hard, Laclau, Mouffe, Negri, Rancière, and Zizek have, according to many, put forth more politically trenchant forms of analysis, sometimes openly rejecting French theoretical developments affiliated with so-called postmodernism and a perceived turn away from the political. In addition to this band of radicals in theory, some of whom are self-proclaimed communists, the third and fourth generations of Frankfurt School critical theory have witnessed a rejuvenation of interest in socialism. Axel Honneth, and overt criticisms of capitalism, Nancy Fraser and Rahel Jaeki. Finally, some of the most cutting-edge forms of theory, including post-colonial theory, subaltern studies, decolonial theory, Afro-pessimism, liberal queer theory, etc., have branded themselves in an implicit teleology as more profoundly political or deeply critical than anything that has preceded them. A few have even claimed, a la Brunto Latour, to surpass critique itself in their level of sophistication. All of this suggests, at least to some, that the Western left intelligentsia's complicity with empire is a thing of the past. The dialectical and historical materialist analysis of these theoretical trends and their knowledge networks demonstrates just the opposite. The patterns analyzed in the first two volumes are alive and well. To perceive them, we have to be able to see through the chameleonic nature of ideology and identify the material relations of ideological production behind it. Engaging in this political economy of knowledge and working through the nuances of the philosophic positions taken by some of the theorists in question will bring to light a lesson that equally applies to the Frankfurt School and French theory. The empire does not promote work that is a real threat to its existence. Although these intellectual traditions have marketed themselves as distinct, and each thinker within them has promoted their own idiosyncratic brand to seemingly no end, there is a remarkable degree of ideological consistency. What they all share in common, and what becomes visible via a materialist analysis of the social totality, is their opposition to actually existing socialism. And only the rarest and absolutely explainable exceptions. They also generally reject communist parties and anti-imperialist state-building projects, and some of them even rebuff parties and disciplined political organizations in general, as well as any focus on state power. Any political solutions they put forth for the problems they diagnose within the capitalist world usually amount to jacqueries, anarchist islands of resistance, liberal political measures, or social democratic reforms devoid of an understanding that the welfare state is an imperial core, in the imperial core was, among other things, a class compromise and ideological construct necessitated by the existence of the Soviet Union. Those that are self-declared communists generally provide little more than idealist projections of a magical third way beyond capitalism and socialism that only exists in their minds. Damn, chat, do you know anyone like that? A lot of people are coming to mind. Hence the importance of systemic ideological criticism, which examines the complex inner workings of the imperial intellectual superstructure and situates the agency of individual knowledge producers within it. This sheds light on the fact that the towering figures of the imperial theory industry are not working in a vacuum. On the contrary, they are producing ideas within a very specific material system of knowledge production that has promoted them precisely because they are doing the type of ideological work necessary to police the left border of critique. They exclude, as beyond the pale, the very idea that knowledge could have real use value by being put in the service of developing anti-imperialist, socialist, state-building projects in the real world of the here and now. Any thoughts, any questions? This chapter was mainly going over his, like, methods, motive, and, the road ahead. What is to be done? What is to be done? He had a Lenin moment. He studied under Derrida. And he hates him. A bit of drama, a bit of intellectual drama. He hates Derrida, and he went to Paris specifically to study under Derrida. And he's like, this guy kind of sucks. He's got like a lot of holes in his analysis, and I don't like it. It's not very good. And then he realized, like, hey, these guys aren't actually engaging with Marxism. They're engaging with, like, compatible left theory, which is why the CIA allows it. So that's just the introduction, basically, to what was it? State power? Introduction to something. And now the next part will be imperial knowledge. Part 1. Part 1. There's 2 parts. Page 65. I'm gonna go back. Where's the frackin'? I've never seen chapters laid out like this. It's very confusing for me. I'm very confused. Wait, where is it? Where's the... Oh my god. Where's the index? Okay. Here we go. This is a pretty long book. This is gonna take forever. Oh yeah, I remembered half of it's the appendix. That's great. That's great. So we're probably gonna split those up. Because part 1 has 3 chapters. It looks like I'm probably gonna do like a chapter a day. Probably. And then, yeah, an intermission in a book. What do you mean, intermezzo? And then part 2 also has 3. Yeah, 3 chapters. Good.